Ivan Mazepa is a renowned Ukrainian leader who made significant contributions to the flourishing of Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian Cossack state in the late 17th century. Because of his desire for Ukraine's freedom from Muscovy, Mazepa aligned himself with the Swedish King Charles XII in a war against the Russian Tsar Peter I, ultimately losing the decisive battle near Poltava in 1709. However, in the 19th century, Mazepa became a prominent cultural figure. George Gordon Byron, Victor Hugo, Juliusz Słowacki, Franz Liszt, Eugène Delacroix created poems, musical compositions, and paintings depicting him as a young man, a political and sexual rebel. This portrayal of Mazepa gained popularity globally, reaching as far as South Africa. We delved into this story with Tony Voss, a South African university professor, Professor Emeritus and Research Associate of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Durban, and Nelson Mandela University, Gqeberha, in South Africa. You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is a podcast by Ukraine World, a multilingual media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of Ukraine World, and the president of PEN Ukraine. Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, a Ukrainian media NGO. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Your contribution is crucial as our media increasingly depends on crowdfunding. Additionally, you can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. This episode is produced in partnership with the Ukrainian Institute, the country's leading cultural diplomacy institution. So, let's start. Tony Voss, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege and for you to invite me, Vlad, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. And it's a very interesting conversation we are going to have because you're in Australia, in Sydney, and I'm in Kyiv, in Ukraine. And we are going to talk about the story of a Ukrainian leader, a Ukrainian Hetman, Ivan Mazepa, who is one of the major figures of the Ukrainian history, but who is also who's become very popular literary and cultural character. First in the European literature and then worldwide. Let us first dive into the story, into the original story of Ivan Mazepa, the famous Ukrainian hetman of the late 17th and early 18th century. Can you tell me a little bit about him?
Well, it's I think you know a lot more than I do, Vlad. My knowledge of Mazepa comes from the mythical and poetic sources. I mean, I have read histories of the Ukraine, but most of my knowledge of Mazepa, as I say, comes from imaginative versions of his story. Well, he's one of those characters, understandably, I think, in whose life myth and history are mixed. I mean, he's a person of heroic dimensions, and exactly what the facts are of his life, you will tell me more clearly than I can know. But he seems, whether he was historically Ukrainian born, I think, and then sent out for his education in Poland and returned either simply or in the mythical way on the back of a wild horse, which brought him back to the Ukraine, I don't know. Maybe you can put me right on that. What exactly his history is, because my understanding of him is very confused with the mythical figure of Mazepa.
Okay, let's just clarify for our listeners why he's important for Ukrainians.
Yes.
It is to cut the story short. Ukrainians had a state, a Cossack state, which rebelled itself against the Polish Rzeczpospolita in mid 17th century, and then allied itself with Muscovy, and then Muscovy started to impose very tyrannical rule over Ukraine,
and there was a big discontentment about it. And at some point, a hetman, or the leader in the state, Ivan Mazepa, started thinking, okay, let's find some allies, probably abroad. And there were northern wars that Peter the First, the Russian Tsar, was leading against the Swedish king Charles XII. And at a certain point, the Swedish army went through Ukraine, went to the south. So it was interesting that this northern war, it's actually the Charles went to the south, and in particular to the central Ukraine. And Mazepa, with part of Ukrainian Cossacks, joined him in his battle, and it was a famous battle of Poltava, 1709, in which Charles and Mazepa lost, and Peter and the Russians won. And this was practically the end of the Swedish expansionism. And from this moment on, Sweden was more and more going into just another direction of development, more peaceful, more trade oriented, more whatever we can say. Russia, on the contrary, has become an empire, a big empire that secured its access to the Baltics, and then by the end of the 18th century, also started conquering the Black Sea region. And at this moment, Catherine II, another Russian empress and dictator, basically exterminated several states in this region, including the remnants of the Ukrainian Cossack state, the Crimean Khanate, the Crimean Tatar state, and started the divisions of Poland. So so this story is very important for Europe, for the world, because basically we are in a situation. The loss of this Poltava battle meant that Russian Empire started moving to Europe, from Eurasia to Europe, and to the big seas, the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. Why it is important? Because everything is happening also today. Russia wants to get back to the Black Sea and get back to the Baltic Sea. So this is the historical context. What interests me is that in the imagination of, let's say, of the European literature, starting with a little bit with Voltaire, but then of course with Byron, it completely changed the accents. And from this very historically important situation, when basically you have the loss of a more or less republican idea of politics and the victory of the imperial idea of politics in the Eastern Europe, they refocus the attention to another story of a young person, young Mazepa, because when Mazepa lost the Poltava battle, he was old, young Mazepa in the Polish court, who seduces a Polish aristocrat, and then as a punishment, he's tied to the horse and sent to the Ukrainian steppes, which in this imagination were completely empty space where you can just go without noticing anyone.
Yeah.
So now let's focus on this story and probably tell me about this mythical side of the story.
Can I just ask one thing, Vlad? So historically, Mazepa is born in the Hetmanate, grows up, and um, is appointed Hetman of the Cossack state. Is that right?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yes. Oh, that's interesting. Yes. And is there the story of the wild ride that is completely mythical? Is it? I mean, that's
It's completely mystical. So we
yes.
don't know whether well, it's for sure it didn't happen, because you cannot actually tie a person to a horse and then ride for 3 days without meeting anyone. Ukraine was, well, probably not as densely populated as Poland at the time, but of course not a desert and not an empty
No,
space.
of
And
course.
this is also an
Yes.
interesting kind of imagination.
Yes, that's interesting. Um, yes, yes. Your question about that essentially, yeah, I think that's true. The European imagination picks up the mythical story of Mazepa, the story of the wild ride. But in fact, it begins with Byron. Byron's poem of 1819, which, as you say, Byron's source was Voltaire, um, but Byron understood something about the significance of Mazepa's story, apart from the wild ride. Of course, he tells that story, but in Byron's poem, um, the setting is the evening of the day of the Battle of Poltava. So the battle is over, and Mazepa and Charles XII are on the run into the Ottoman Empire, where they will seek refuge and where Mazepa himself will die. And on that evening, Mazepa tells the story of his life, basically, but especially of his wild ride. And interestingly enough, as I say, Byron understands the circumstances. I think he knows that that the anxiety of Mazepa's nation is at stake, that empires are taking over, that that there are risks for nations, that individual nations are at risk in the face of these powerful empires that are taking over. So Byron's poem, which is the launching pad, as it were, for the romantic Mazepa in the European imagination, in fact, is much more, I think, understanding of the historical Mazepa. It sets the wild ride against the man who is striving for the identity and the independence of his nation, basically. So it's from I think it's what the European imagination does with with uh, with that story that follows Byron after the French painters and the French poets essentially take it off into a completely different direction. But I think Byron himself, um, like his source, Voltaire, understood what was at stake here. And Byron himself, in his experience, if you think about Byron, he himself had explored the frontiers of Europe, geographically, philosophically, ethically, and even politically. I mean, he'd sought out the East, he'd sought out Orientalism, he'd aligned himself with the struggle for Greek independence. He'd traveled all across the borders of Europe. He'd studied different languages, and he'd lived a life on the edge. He understood imaginatively, I think, the crisis for Europe and Europe's civilization. And in another poem, the Ode on Venice, which actually appeared in the same book originally on its first appearance, appeared in a volume with Byron's Mazepa. He writes, "There is no hope for nations." So, threatened by empires, as it were, on all sides, um, nations had a grim future to look forward to. Um,
Th-
yeah,
That's very interesting because, yeah, I think he creates a character which is at the same time it's transgressor, but in the good sense of the term. It's a person of a borderland, but borderland not only geographical, but also moral and political. So we see in Mazepa this libertarianism or not libertarian, libertinage. So a person who can cross the amorous erotic borders by seducing another a woman which is married. And of course we see that another character which was important for Byron is Don Juan. But at the same time it's a political character. It's like Child Garald a little bit, so it's a combination of Don Juan and Child Garald.
interesting.
And
Yes,
yeah, and this political and erotic challenge at the same time, or aeropolitical challenge,
yes,
right? And what is important is how viral it became. And we forget a little bit about that, but it's, I mean, the Mazepa character became viral for the European culture in the same way as Don Juan, for example, and there are so many replications because of that. So we have Victor Hugo, who writes his Mazepa poem a few years after. We have Delacroix, who paints Mazepa. We have I think Jericho or somebody else, right? Who Chasserio, also in other paintings. So the French painters. One of my favorite thing is the symphonic poem of Franz Liszt, which is amazing. For me, it's one of the best examples of Liszt's composition. It's like, and it's really a wide ride. So symphonically, musically, it's a very dynamic piece. I really advise to our listeners to listen it. It's like rock opera right now. You can listen to it as a, very, very dynamic, very interesting, amazingly orchestrated. So Ferenc Liszt writes a symphonic poem about Mazepa. Like, can you tell me why it has become so viral? Why everybody jumps into this subject? Let's say in the 1820s and probably 1830s a little bit.
Um, yes, that's a good question. I'm not sure that I have a comprehensive answer, but I think there are two strands to the answer. One is um, the mere excitement of the ride and the sort of thematic excitement of a journey from life to death, through death in life back to living again. So the Mazepa, who is virtually, in the imagination at least, condemned to death by being strapped to the wild horse, thinking that he'll never come out alive anywhere, gets through that and comes out to survive um, in the East in his resurrection, as it were. So that, I think that's the first. I don't know if I've made that clear, Vlad, of that the romantic energy of the image itself. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, I also read this story as a kind of mystical story of going through death to life, back to life. So it's a story of regeneration, because the story of this wide ride is that at a certain moment, young Mazepa, naked, tied to the horse, is on the way of dying. So he has no food, he has no drink, and then he goes to kind of a death sleep, and then there is a woman that basically recovers him and helps him. And it's a very important, for the romanticism, very important metaphor of regeneration and resurrection.
yes, yes, I think that's true. I mean, and even the fact that the horse in I think in all the stories, the horse that has carried him dies under Mazepa, and he is still strapped to the horse, and it's only the advent of the maiden who who comes to save him that brings him, as it were, back to life at that moment. But I mean, that, as you say, that's a very powerful image and narrative which the romantic imagination takes up. But I think there's another aspect to it, which of all the painters, and I think of all the artists who pick it up in the 19th century, um, the painters and poets, I think the one who understands it in a more complex way is Delacroix. Um, I think he sees in that image of um, the man um, completely dependent on the horse in a sense. Um, he sees the passing of a certain age. We're in the early 19th century. We're on the moment at which, in a sense, we're moving from horsepower to steam power to engines of a different kind. And I think Delacroix understands that. And he sees in the image of Mazepa the passing of a certain age, the passing of a certain kind of power, the passing of a certain kind of relationship between the human um, and the animal. And I think that's why Delacroix is the the most profound of the painters and artists who pick up and work with the theme of Mazepa. Um, I think, from what I've read, I think the poets are satisfied with the romantic image, whereas Delacroix is looking for something else. I think for and later on, of course, we'll see something like that in those images of the man dependent on the horse, as opposed to the man, as it were, controlling the horse. Sorry, that's a bit confused, but I think
No, no, that's very interesting because it leads us to the beginning of the Byron story, if I remember it correctly, why Mazepa is telling his story about the white ride to the Charles the 12th after the Poltava battle, because Charles is amazed how skillful Mazepa is on the horse, still in his old age, and how connected they are. And Mazepa is telling, look, we are kind of the same, because I had this story. I was tied to a horse for 3 days. And it's a very interesting reflection upon how the human and the animalistic world are connected. And maybe you're right that this is description how this connection has gone. Yeah, let me ask you just a small question about your reading of Pushkin version of it, the Russian version of it, if you studied that, because in my opinion, what Pushkin does in his poem Poltava is trying to fight against this very viral story, European story, and show Mazepa is completely opposite. So not as erotically attractive, but as erotically bad, as immoral, as an old man who is seducing a young woman. So he basically places him in a completely different episode of his life, and of course, not as a political rebellion or political freedom fighter, as it was for Byron and for Hugo and for many others, but as a political traitor. So I read Pushkin as a kind of this imperial empire strikes back story, the imperial imagination, how they try to deconstruct this romantic story. What do you think?
yes, it's a long time since I read the translation of the Pushkin, but that is my impression of it. Yes, it's an answering back in a sense. It's um, you called it imperial. That I don't. You would understand that better than I do, I imagine. Uh, how does it feel then? You saying that Pushkin's is a kind of imperial version of the story. How does that come? How does that feel for you coming from the Ukraine today?
Well, it feels not good, because this is the way how the Russian literature often, I'm not saying always, but often went into supporting these imperial narratives. And there are lots of these episodes in Pushkin when he says that, for example, the Slavic rivers will collide into a Russian sea, or his very big anti-Polish statements. And of course, in Poltava, he basically, my reproach to him is that not only that he depicts Mazepa in such a bad way, but that he shows the Ukrainian Cossacks as something of the past and very bloody murderers figures, who are very cruel, and we should leave them in the past. Whereas the reality is the opposite. It was Russian Empire who was bloody and cruel, and basically suppressed the freedom loving nations which were living near it.
Yes, in a very general way. I mean, I don't have your knowledge and detail of it, but that certainly is my impression. That that it's it's an im- it's an imperial response to well, it's not even nationalistic, is it? I mean, is Mazepa is he a nationalistic figure in Ukrainian history? I mean, is he?
I would not say nationalistic. I would say rather patriotic, or just state builder. State builder. Okay, let me for our listeners, if you are interested in kind of go deeper in this Russian element, we can discuss it for our patrons, like in a special episode. But what interests me, Tony, is where does the story go afterwards? Because I've heard so many stories and I haven't studied them, that the story goes to America in some way, the story goes to Africa in some way. Can you tell me more? That interests me very much.
I don't have all the details, Vlad. You know, I'd be very much talking from memory and impression here. I don't have notes in front of me that I can work from. But let me go back to okay. Byron's poem appears in 1819. In 1820, a Scottish poet settled in South Africa. His name is Thomas Pringle, and he's thought of in South Africa as the so-called father of South African English poetry. Possibly his most famous poem is a poem called Afar in the Desert, which is a Mazepa poem. It's a poem of riding out into the desert. Of course, he's not strapped to the horse. He rides out into the desert on the horse, but it's a wild ride into the desert, and it takes him, as it takes Mazepa, through the desert into survival. And the poem ends with an image of where there is, silence, there is God. There's a kind of divine ending to the poem. Now, that's one example of the of the way in which Byron's account of Mazepa was taken up at the time. And of course, there are other examples at about that same time. Why I find Pringle interesting, if you don't mind, I'll just go on a little sidelight at the moment. Is that okay? A little diversion. Is that all right?
Sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Pringle was also not only a poet in South Africa, he also fought for the freedom of the press, and he also fought for the rights and liberties of the indigenous people. So he's an important figure. And this is my diversion now. I first became interested in or made any connection with the Ukraine when I heard about a book. Forgive me, forgive my pronunciation, but a book called Thomas Pringle, Ushno-Afrikanski Democrat. Have I got that right?
Yes, it's okay. Yeah.
Yes. Does that mean Thomas Pringle, South African Democrat?
Exactly. Yes.
Yes. Okay. And that's a book published in Moscow in 1985. So it's interesting that the person who published it was a graduate of the University of Odessa, and he was working on a collection of documents and books put together in the late 18th century and the early 19th century by the noble Vorontsov family. And that collection is now in the Odessa State University Library. I don't know if I have that right, but that's what my reading told me. So why I find Pringle interesting is that he picks up both the Mazepa image of the wild and the romantic ride, and also the political the principles of liberty and independence that in another way are associated with Mazepa. So that quite early version of a Mazepa story, 1830 perhaps, is the date of 1826, the date of Pringle's poem, Afar in the Desert, makes an interesting connection. I don't think then, of course, the story spreads in various ways. There are German and Italian versions of the story, not all of them in verse, of course, some short novels and some longer novels in English and the other European languages that I know tell the story of Mazepa. Many of them concentrate on Mazepa's revenge when he goes back to burn the castle of the husband of the young woman, the husband who first punished him by strapping him to the back of the wild horse and sending him off into the desert. So that's one of the versions of the story that is repeated. I think when the American version, I only know one American version, and that's also interesting, I think, because it tells a story of basically a cowboy and an indigenous American, a Native American young woman, the romantic story, and he is punished in the way that Mazepa is, but it has a romantic ending in that they come together at the end. I mean, that's a very popular story. That's nothing like Byron. That's nothing like Pringle. It's nothing like the later versions of the Mazepa story that we hear, but it's an interesting one. The other American one that I'm aware of is a 1920s poem. Yes, I can't remember the name of the poet now, but that's in that case the title is rather ironic. Then the other important, for me anyway, the other interesting modern version of the story is the poem by the later South African poet Roy Campbell. He's born in 1902, I think, and his poem Mazepa appears in about 1930, and it's basically a retelling of the Victor Hugo story. So it's very much the romantic version, and the poet is, the Mazepa figure is the poet whose imagination is free, who takes the risks, who is carried away by the imagination in the way that Mazepa is carried away on a horse. I'm sorry, that's not very, very, very coherent. I haven't got notes of the particular poems that I can point to, but the story takes you all the way through from Byron in 1819 to the 20th century. I think the most important version of the Mazepa's figure that comes out in the modern period is the version by Brecht. Bertolt Brecht German version of the story, which is very, very detached, uh, very clear, very definite, um, but simply tells the story. That's all. But there's very much a modernist version of the story, a kind of it's difficult to describe because it's dispassionate. It tries to tell this story of a man tied to a horse and carried away without without passion. And I think it's yes, I think of all the versions of the story, I think it's my favorite. Sorry, that's a bit confused, but
No, no, it's I'm sorry. It's very very interesting, and thank you for telling this story. I can tell you that I am amazed by this romantic imagination, but at the same time, I'm very critical about it. Both Byron and Hugo and many others. Why I told you a little bit about that because basically it creates the image of Ukraine as an empty space which is not populated, where there are no people, and therefore it creates this image of Ukraine as a space, as a territory that you can feel with
that is open to
open to
yes,
invasions, open to colonization, open
yes,
to everything, and all the stories that we try to tell about ourselves, the Ukrainians, that not this is this is the opposite of what you think about Ukraine. This is not an empty space. This is a place where so many cultures were here, from the millennia, from four or five thousand years ago, and they're very interesting, and there is a parts of Greek culture, there is parts of Scythian culture, there is Gothic culture, there is Scandinavian culture, there is Byzantine culture, there is Turkic speaking, Iranian speaking, Slavic speaking, Jewish speaking, Yiddish speaking, whatever else, and Ukrainian speaking, and it's so interesting. But yeah, so this romantic imagination creates this image of the empty space, and therefore I'm kind of cautious about it. But what you describe is that why it was so attractive, and maybe let's reflect upon this, because I know, for example, that in South Africa there is a Mazepa Bay, and as far as I know, the story is it was because the one ship which was called Mazepa came to rescue some people there, and it was called Mazepa because ships were called Mazepa because there were symbols of speed or something. So for you, what unites all this story? Is that this drive for freedom? Is that this appetite for freedom, or the idea of a speed, idea of freedom in the empty space? What do you think?
that's a very interesting question. Um, yes, the Mazepa Bay in South Africa was named for a ship, a schooner, and at any one time during the 19th century, if you look at the Lloyd's Register of Shipping, that's the English register of current shipping. At any one time, there would be 6 or 8 ships sailing around the world with the name Mazepa. Um, Byron himself called his own yacht Mazepa. And the ship that sailed in 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 South Africa, um, yes, was involved in a rescue, in an escape when the British were at war with the Boers, the Afrikaners, in what is now Natal. Um, some people hid aboard the Mazepa and um, escaped the Boers and sailed out to sea and came back only when British troops had returned to Natal and they were able to come back safe. But that doesn't answer your very important question about is the open space a space for freedom? Was your question something like that, Floyd?
Exactly. I mean, what romantics saw as an advantage. Okay, I'm driving with my horse. There is an empty space. I'm a maybe in America. I'm a cowboy who is colonizing this empty space, and I'm finally free of all institutions, free of restraints. Well, if you look at it from the autochtonic point of view of people who are living there, and there are always people who are living there, it's kind of this gesture of erasing them from the memory, from the history. That's what worries me. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yes, of course. I think yes. I mean, yes, and I think there are lots of examples of that. I mean, even in Pringle's poem, "Afar in the Desert," you know, even in 1820, you couldn't ride through South Africa and not come across settled people who'd been there hundreds of years. So I think one has to be, as with any, what shall we say, myth, one has to be cautious. One has to set what the imagination does with a myth against what, as far as one can tell, were the historical facts of the case at the time. And I think Mazepa is a wonderful example of that, of, that there is a historical Mazepa faced up to very difficult political challenges, and there is that romantic figure that the imagination plays with much later. But it's a fascinating.
Absolutely, Tony. Absolutely. And thank you so much for telling these other stories, the South African story and American story, and maybe there are some other stories, because we see how viral Mazepa is in the world culture. There is another part of the story which is Ukrainian story. We have poems by Ukrainian authors, very interesting, by Volodymyr Sosura, for example, or by some others who are trying to to think about this Byron's myth, and to counteract with the Pushkin's alternative myth, right? And also, of course, react and regenerate some historical truth. But it's interesting. I mean, I have the ambiguous feeling about that, because I told you that I'm critical about that, but still, it's fascinating. I mean, Byron's poem is so beautiful, and Victor Hugo poem is very, very interesting, because it dives even deeper into this imagination of regeneration. And as I told you, Liszt's symphonic poem Franz Liszt is one of my favorite music pieces. So I will also read the authors you quoted to enlarge my knowledge. Thank you so much, Tony, for this very interesting conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. It's really a privilege, and I wish you well. I'm going to keep in touch with you. Thank you so much, Floyd. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the
Thanks.
best to you and yours. Bye-bye.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by Ukraine World, a multilingual media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of Ukraine World, and the president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Tony Voss, a South African university professor. We talked about the legend of Ivan Mazepa, a prominent cultural figure and prominent political figure in Ukraine, who later became, after his death, a prominent cultural figure, popular in Europe, in America, but also in South Africa. Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Your contribution is crucial, as our media increasingly depends on crowdfunding. Additionally, you can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas, where we provide aid to both soldiers and civilians. We bring essential supplies such as cars for soldiers and books for civilians. You can support our trips by donating through PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This episode is produced in partnership with the Ukrainian Institute, the country's leading cultural diplomacy institution. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.